Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we're entering into part 2 of the layout extension, and I think just before I begin I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of those who provided feedback on part 1. So it would seem I have a reasonable amount of enthusiasm from my viewers as to the progress for this extension. So absolutely fantastic, and as I mentioned, a huge thank you to those who have commented. So today we actually get into the build itself. So after nearly a year of anticipation, we finally get this project underway. Now today's video will cover the assembly of the actual framework for the new extension area. So some of the segments in this video are sort of aimed at the beginner model railroader. So I go into some sort of quite specific processes about the baseboard framework assembly and the methods that I use to put together a frame. And at the end of this video I'll also provide some information about the amount of materials that I used, includes the timber and screws and so forth, and sort of generally a rough idea of how much it cost me here in New Zealand. So that may be of interest as well, comparing how that stacks up against materials available in other countries. So I think without further ado, let's just get into it. Now, taking a closer look at the track plan, and in particular the extension, we also have here overlaid what I will probably include as a scenic break of some sort. Now, I haven't actually figured that out just yet, but it's just sort of to indicate that this piece here would be hidden, and it basically hides the sharper radius curves at this point. So based on this extension here and this small piece down here, I have worked at a 1-to-1 scale to ascertain the required amount of framework timber. So in this particular situation, and to sort of tie in with the existing baseboard framework, I have chosen to use 85 by 18 millimeter pine clears. So this is dressed timber, and working with the actual extension at 1-to-1 scale, I can then work out where to position the struts that we need within the framework, and also work out dimensions between different components of the framework. So unlike possibly a standard baseboard framework, this framework is very much based around where the track layout is. So essentially this is the framework for the lower level, which is the green panelled area and the yellow tracks that run around through here. Now the upper level, which is these slightly paler lines that run above, they will actually be mounted on an elevated section of baseboard, which will just follow where the track actually goes, and we'll show you that in a minute or two. Now, a couple of other things that I've done here is, in here I have actually put in the outline of some Mark 1 coaches, which are the longest stock that I actually have, just so that I can confirm clearances for corners, and also potentially giving me an indication of what kind of vertical supports I could fit in here for the upper level of track. Now over here you'll see that this track sort of disappears off the edge. Now this will be part of the upper level, which would actually extend out. So the white area in the middle is basically an open cavity. This I may actually build a separate component that actually drops in and out. So that space could potentially be used as a scenic area, and only lifted out when needed to actually get into access, particularly the rear of the layout and where the fiddle yards are underneath. So with all of this worked out and mapping out where the actual framework goes and the struts, and working out the distances between the struts and things like that, I was then able to map out the actual timber that we needed, and this is sort of basically come up out of 8 lengths of 2.4 meters long. And this then actually also takes me to another plan of what dimensions and also shapes that I need to cut out of the plywood. So unlike the other parts of my baseboard where I used 5-6mm MDF, this time I'm using ply because it is a much preferred substrate material for baseboards. MDF does have the notorious habit of warping, particularly in moist conditions, whereas the ply is a lot more rigid. So the ply I'm going to be using is the 7mm ply, so it's kind of as close as possible to the 5 or 6mm MDF that I've got, but I'm still going to have to sort of alter the height of the framework so that I get a flat or flush baseboard layer between the two different substrates. Now over here, this is the shape that's going to be cut out for the upper section of the track, and then this strip here will actually run right across the back at the upper level as well. So that's sort of basically where I got to in terms of the actual planning of the materials that are needed to build the framework and the baseboard layer. So with this all printed out, we can hit the saw and start cutting some of this stuff out. Okay, so we're now over in the workshop. Station Road is just over here on my left, and this is the new work area now for the extension, which will end up sort of basically behind me here. So the majority of the framework build I will actually just simply speed up and race through it, but I thought I'd just show you a close-up tutorial of how I go about assembling the joints for the timber framing. So before we begin though, I thought I'd just run through some of the basic equipment that I use. That includes equipment for cutting and so forth, but also safety equipment. And I'll probably sort of point out, I guess, really, I mean, this particular section of the video is probably directed more to those who are just starting out in railway modelling and maybe don't sort of have any sort of idea where to begin in terms of the framework. For all of those seasoned railway modelers out there, you'll probably think, well, this is just one particular technique, and you're absolutely right, because there are many different ways of assembling a framework for a baseboard. I am just showing you simply the method that I use, which I find works pretty well. The key aspects that are very important are accurate measurements and square cuts. If either one of those is not sort of really adhered to, you kind of end up with all sorts of wonky framework. So in terms of tools, well, you probably see right straight away, right next to me here is my compound chop saw. Now, I do a lot of other woodworking as well. I've made little bits of furniture and things like this, so this is kind of really a must-have for my workshop. And although it's a pretty budget brand, it certainly does make for cutting timber at right angles and also making a very clean and tidy cut. Now, there are alternatives to buying one of these, and I'll just pop these up on the screen. You've got your standard sort of miter box and saw, and then also there's a sort of more elaborate miter saw as well, and both of those actually really work quite well in terms of getting nice square cuts, or even cuts at 45 degrees or you know, specific angles that you might need. So other items, well, the trusty old stainless steel ruler. I've got this one here, there's a meter ruler. Now when it comes to measuring the timber, I actually use the 1 meter steel rule. I don't actually use a tape measure. Now a tape measure is great for getting a general approximate measurement of something, but if you want to do accurate measuring, I don't really trust the tape measure, because you've got to take into account the little tab at the end and the fact that it's flexible and can twist and bend. I think the steel ruler is a much more accurate option for measuring. We also have other things here. We have our adjustable square, which also has a 45-degree angle, comes in handy. We have over here, of course, our cordless drill with a selection of drill bits. In terms of safety, particularly when I'm using this saw here, I've got my earmuffs and also protective goggles. Now admittedly, I actually just use my reading glasses because I actually can't see anything. We've also got a screwdriver with changeable attachments on the end, and then lastly, and probably quite important, is this little thing here. Now this is a right angle clamp, so when it comes to joining up bits of timber, and this is what I'm going to work on as a sample, is just simply creating a right angle joint here. So these come in real handy when getting a nice square right angle corner. We also have wood glue, PVA glue here, which is a must-have for your wood joints. Now in this process, and pretty much every time I build up any kind of framework, I screw and glue the timber. So we've got our box of screws here, and then it's also glued, so you end up with a very, very sturdy joint. Some other things that may come in handy, of course, is just your standard G-clamps for working away at the different areas if you need to clamp sections of timber. And once again, as before, lots and lots of drill bits comes in handy as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll zoom in on this area here, and we'll just, with these bits of offcut here, we'll just go through the process of how I put together a standard sort of joint in a timber frame. Right, so using these bits of timber, we're just going to basically make a right angle joint here. Now this would also apply if there was a intermediate strut running through at a point like that, or at the end. So as I mentioned earlier, I'll be using the 85 by 18 millimeter pine dressed timber. So essentially what I do is I have two drill sizes, and we have a screw here. So this is our pilot hole that is drilled through both sets of timber, and then with the outer piece of timber I drill a much larger hole. Now the reason I do that is because basically I want the screw to bite into the actual piece of timber that's running through here, and not to actually bite into the upper or outer layer of timber. So it does create a little bit of flexibility for when the screw bites in, clamps down on this outer timber, and basically presses the glue in at the same time. So we'll go through the process. Now the first thing I do is, using our right angle clamp, is we just position this over both pieces, get that into a square So essentially the idea of this clamp really is basically locking the two pieces of timber together while the pilot holes are drilled, so we sort of avoid the drill bit either skating around or the either of the two pieces of timber moving out of alignment with each other. So we'll drill the pilot holes. Now one of the other aspects that I actually do in terms of the pilot hole in here, now I could go to the lengths of drawing out halfway down here, so measuring 9 millimeters in, drilling even amount of holes from top and bottom, but essentially I just sort of do it by eye. But the one thing I do is I take another piece of the same timber and just line it up on the edge and mark a line down the edge, so we end up with a line down there that indicates basically where that other piece of timber is sitting underneath. And then just simply by eye and with our pilot drill bit, we'll drill these holes. Right, so there's the holes drilled through there. I've just done it by eye, reasonably straightforward to do. And then basically we can unclamp this now. And essentially what we'll do now with this piece here is drill out the pilot holes with the large drill bit. So that's the larger hole drilled now through the outer piece of timber. And it's then just basically a simple case of running some glue on the joint. And screwing the screws in. Now I actually hand screw the screws in because you could use your drill to drill these in, but of course by doing so you kind of can run the risk of stripping any thread or bite into the timber. So I actually find I have much better control just by screwing these in. Then you can actually sort of get a gauge of the tension on the screw. And that's what you end up with. Now, of course, the other benefit too in actually drilling out the pilot hole on this piece of timber to a larger hole is that when you screw it in, it countersinks itself into the timber for a flush finish. And of course, you could even screw it in further and then fill a hole if you wanted to hide your screws. Now, I'm not going to that extent. Of course, the other aspect too is that some people might want to actually mitre these corners so that you have a flush joint, so you don't end up with a joint at the end like that. But honestly, for the sake of a timber frame for the baseboard, I'm really not that fussed about going that far with preparing the timber. But essentially what you end up with is a nice square joint, and it's nice and flush as well. So that's basically how I go about it. So what we'll do now is we'll get into actually building the actual frame itself, and I'll start with the smaller section first and then get on to the main framework after that. Now I'm just going to speed through this as I put it together, otherwise you might fall asleep watching me building a frame. Right, well, there is the frame, more or less complete. There's one strut that I haven't put in yet, which I'm actually going to leave until further down the track, just because I'm not quite sure where I'll position it. But that was quite a mission. I guess probably in total, if we do all the cutting and measuring and all that kind of stuff, it probably took about 8 hours, but I've spread it out across a few days. So I'm just temporarily resting it in the position that it's going to go. So we've just got it resting on the edge there. It's a little bit higher than what it actually will be. It will actually be a bit lower down than this, just slightly. So, well, there we have the framework. So there we have it. That is the framework now assembled. So before I actually attach the framework to the existing baseboard, there is some work to actually do on the existing baseboard that will be easier to do before I put the extension in place. It's just simply for access reasons, and also to get the correct level between the existing baseboard and the new extension. So towards the end of the speeded up clip, you may have noticed that essentially what I did is actually build the framework in two halves. So it sort of made assembly a little bit easier to manage. Once the two halves were assembled, I then joined them together to make up the complete framework. So some people may believe I've over-engineered the framework assembly, and what is wrong with whacking a few nails into a piece of timber. Now, the reason why I sort of go to those levels in terms of the actual framework, because yes, nails and glue would actually work probably just as well, because really at the end of the day, and there's not a lot of strength required to actually support the layout itself, the track bed and the rolling stock and train operations on top. The reason why I sort of go the extra mile with screwing and gluing the joints together is the idea behind it is that if by chance I had to move this layout, or if we move to a new house, then basically these sections can actually be detached from each other, and they're sturdy enough for them to be manhandled and shoved into the back of a truck if needed. So in terms of materials, and as I mentioned in the video, I bought 8 lengths at 2.4 meters, and that worked out at 19 point something or other meters of total timber. Now the actual build itself, and I've got it written down here, used 17.1 lineal meters for the framework that was actually used, and I bought this timber at my local timber merchant, which do offer timber at a much more reduced price than, say for example, if I went to Bunnings or Mitre 10 here in New Zealand. Now they price their timber at $4.70 per lineal metre at a local timber merchant, whereas if I went to Bunnings or Mitre 10, it would essentially be double the price for the same timber. So in total, I worked out roughly about 80 New Zealand dollars for the timber that was actually used in the build itself. The actual total timber purchase came to about $90. Now, I'll include everything that was bought, and that of course includes the screws as well. Now, I bought a pack of 250 screws because I need screws anyway. They're always needed for building things, but 66 screws were actually used in the build itself, and they worked out at 8 cents each, so I spent $5.30 on the screws. Now, of course, there's other bits and pieces in there, like the glue that I used and things like that. That would have been pretty marginal. But essentially, at the end of the day, to actually build the framework that you've just seen in the video, I spent $85.30 on the materials. And that roughly works out about 45 quid. So in the end, I sort of felt it was a reasonably economical build for the extension framework. So I guess I can sort of give you an idea of what's going to happen in part 3. And as I mentioned a little earlier, one of the things I need to do first is deal with the existing layout, the particular area that's going to require basically realigning and remodeling to work in with the new extension. And if we just pop up a wee image here, and you can see the red outlined image, that sort of basically indicates the area that's going to get ripped up. So with that section needing to be replaced, and of course that area there will be replaced with the MDF so that it matches in with the rest of the existing layout. The next component will be after that, well, once that area is actually clear, then I'll probably start assembling some of the track work on that particular area. And once I've done that, then I can actually install the new framework, and that will be bolted to the existing framework. So that's something to look forward to for the next episode in this series. So I think I will leave it there. That is the end of part 2. Thank you again, everyone, for taking an interest in this particular series, and I will catch you in the next episode. Bye for now.